Part 2. Tithing under the Old Covenant. Chapter 4. The Tithes of Israel. More than a tenth. Imagine a conversation between two sincere believers discussing tithing after a Bible study. One says, "The Bible teaches the tithe." The other responds, "Which tithe?" The first believer pauses, slightly puzzled. "The tithe," he replies, "the 10%. For many Christians, that answer seems entirely sufficient. The word tithe immediately suggests 10% of one's income given to support the work of God. Yet, a careful reading of Scripture reveals a more complex picture. Biblical tithing was not an isolated practice, but part of Israel's covenant life, connected to the land, the Levite, the priesthood, worship, and community responsibilities. Much of the modern discussion assumes that biblical tithing consisted of a single 10% contribution serving a single purpose. However, the biblical texts contain references to tithes that fulfilled different functions within Israel. Recognizing this complexity does not settle every question concerning Christian giving, but it does require us to examine the biblical evidence carefully before drawing conclusions. Why this matters. At first glance, the distinction between one tithe and several tithes may appear insignificant. Yet, understanding Scripture on its own terms requires us to examine biblical institutions as they are actually presented rather than as they are commonly assumed. The phrase, the biblical tithe, is often used as though Scripture describes a single practice with a single purpose. Yet, passages in Numbers, Deuteronomy, Chronicles, and Nehemiah reveal a broader picture. Some texts emphasize support for the Levite. Others focus on worship and covenant celebration before the Lord. Still, others provide for the stranger, the widow, and the fatherless. These differences naturally raise an important question. Are these references describing one identical tithe, or do they reflect different dimensions of a larger system? The answer matters because it affects how we interpret the passages themselves. If Scripture presents multiple tithes serving multiple purposes, reducing the entire system to a single 10% contribution may overlook important details. Our task is not to defend assumptions, but to allow the biblical data to speak for itself. Introducing the tithing system. The first explicit legislation concerning tithing appears in the Law of Moses. Leviticus 27 verse 30 states, "And all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree, is the Lord. It is holy unto the Lord." A few verses later, Scripture adds, "And concerning the tithe of the head, or of the flock, even of whatsoever passeth under the rod, the tenth shall be holy unto the Lord." Leviticus 27 verse 32. These verses establish an important foundation. The tithe belonged to the Lord and was regarded as holy. As Israel's covenant life developed, further instructions clarified its recipients, administration, and purposes. Numbers 18 connected the tithe to the support of the Levites. Deuteronomy introduced additional dimensions, including worship, covenant celebrations, and provisions for vulnerable members of society. Historical books such as Chronicles and Nehemiah later demonstrate how these instructions operated in practice. Together, these passages reveal a system designed to support ministry, sustain worship, strengthen community life, and reinforce covenant responsibility. As we examine these texts, Our goal is not merely to catalog ancient regulations, but to understand what God established, why He established it, and what lessons may be drawn from it today. Before considering what was tithed, we must first understand the various tithes that existed within Israel's covenant life. Only then can we appreciate the full scope of the system God established for His people. The Levitical tithe. The first tithe most readers encounter in Scripture is a tithe assigned to the support of the Levites. Having already examined the unique position of the tribe of Levi, we are now in a position to understand why this tithe existed and how it functioned within Israel's covenant life. The foundational passage is found in Numbers 18. After outlining the responsibilities of the priests and Levites, God addressed their provision. Numbers 18 verse 21 states, "And behold, I have given the children of Levi all the tenth in Israel for an inheritance, for their service which they serve, even the service of the tabernacle of the congregation." A few verses later, God explained further, "But the tithes of the children of Israel, which they offer as an heave offering unto the Lord, I have given to the Levites to inherit. Therefore, I have said unto them, among the children of Israel, they shall have no inheritance." Numbers 18 verse 24. These verses reveal the primary purpose of the Levitical tithe. It functioned as provision for those set apart for service in connection with the tabernacle. Because the Levites received no tribal inheritance comparable to other tribes, God assigned the tithe as their inheritance within Israel's covenant structure. The tithe therefore formed part of a divinely established arrangement rather than a simple donation to religious workers. The Levites themselves were not exempt from giving. Having received the tithe from Israel, they were instructed to present a tithe of the tithe to the priests. Numbers 18 verse 26 records, "Thus speak unto the Levites, and say unto them, When ye take of the children of Israel the tithes which I have given you from them for your inheritance, then ye shall offer up an heave offering of it for the Lord, even a tenth part of the tithe." This arrangement illustrates the interconnected nature of the system. The people supported the Levites supported the priests, and the priests ministered before God on behalf of the nation. Viewed in this context, the Levitical tithe appears not as an isolated financial requirement, but as part of God's provision for the maintenance of worship and ministry within Israel. The festival tithe. If Numbers 18 were the only passage discussing tithing, the subject might appear relatively straightforward. However, Deuteronomy introduces another dimension of the tithing system that does not fit neatly within the category of Levitical support alone. Deuteronomy 14:22-23 instructs, "Thou shalt truly tithe all the increase of thy seed, that the field bringeth forth year by year. And thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God, in a place which he shall choose to place his name there, the tithe of thy corn, of thy wine, and of thine oil, and the firstlings of thy herds and of thy flocks, that thou mayest learn to fear the Lord thy God always." These verses introduce an important distinction. Unlike the Levitical tithe described in Numbers 18, this tithe was associated with worship, celebration, and fellowship before the Lord. Rather than being transferred entirely to the Levites, the worshippers themselves participated in consuming it in God's presence. The purpose of this tithe was to foster covenant remembrance and joyful worship. The people were not merely contributing resources, they were gathering before God to celebrate His goodness and acknowledge His provision. The tithe therefore functioned as part of a communal act of worship in which gratitude, reverence, and fellowship were expressed together. The legislation also anticipated practical difficulties for those living far from the central place of worship. Deuteronomy 14, verse 24 to 26 states, "And if the way be too long for thee, so that thou art not be able to carry it, or if the place be too far from thee, which the Lord thy God shall choose to set thy name there, where the Lord thy God had blessed thee, then shalt thou turn it into money, and bind up the money in thine hand, and shalt go unto the place which the Lord thy God shall choose. And thou shalt bestow that money for whatsoever thy soul lusteth after, for oxen or for sheep, or for wine or for strong drink, or for whatsoever thy soul desireth. And thou shalt eat there before the Lord thy God, and thou shalt rejoice, thou and thine household." This passage demonstrates that money was known and used within Israel, yet the money served as a temporary substitute for transportation. Upon arrival, it was used to obtain the items necessary for the covenant celebration. The focus remained on the festal meal and the worship associated with it. The festival tithe therefore reveals another important dimension of God's design. Tithing was not merely about supporting ministry. It also served to cultivate worship, gratitude, fellowship, and joyful remembrance of God's faithfulness. A third category of tithing appears in Deuteronomy 14, verse 28 to 29, and 26, verse 12 to 15. Every third year, Israel was instructed to store a tithe locally for the benefit of the Levites, foreigners, widows, and orphans. This provision reveals the social dimension of the tithing system. Tithing was not directed solely toward worship or the support of religious service. It also functioned as a means of caring for vulnerable members of the covenant community. Through this arrangement, God provided for those who lacked inheritance, family support, or economic security. It is also worth noting that scripture frequently refers to tithes in the plural. For example, Deuteronomy 12:6 states, "And thither ye shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices and your tithes and heave offerings of your hand and your vows and your freewill offerings and the firstling of your herds and of your flocks." Likewise, Deuteronomy 12:17 speaks of the tithe of thy corn, of thy wine, or of thy oil. The plural usage does not by itself settle the debate, but it reminds us that the biblical picture is richer and more multifaceted than a simple formula. What can be stated with confidence is that the tithing system served multiple functions within Israel's covenant life. It supported ministry, facilitated worship, encouraged covenant celebration, provided for the vulnerable, and reinforced Israel's covenant identity. For this reason, reducing the entire system to a single statement, such as the biblical tithe was 10%, may unintentionally obscure important aspects of the evidence. The question is not merely how much was given, but why it was given, to whom it was given, and within what covenant framework it operated. What percentage was actually given? One of the most common assumptions in modern discussion is that biblical tithing consisted of a straightforward 10% contribution. While the word tithe certainly denotes a tenth, the practical operation of the Israelite system appears more nuanced when all the relevant passages are considered together. The Levitical tithe represents a tenth assigned to the Levites as their inheritance. The festival tithe involved another tenth connected to worship and rejoicing before the Lord. The third-year tithe introduced additional obligations associated with caring for vulnerable members of the society. Depending on how one understands the relationship between these tithes, the total amount devoted to covenant purposes may have exceeded a simple 10% calculation. The precise mathematics of the system has not been debated extensively, and this chapter is not the place to examine every position in detail. The broader point is more important. The biblical tithe was not merely a percentage detached from purpose. It functioned within a comprehensive covenant arrangement designed to sustain worship, ministry, and community life. This observation helps explain why Scripture consistently emphasizes the purpose of the tithe alongside its amount. The Levites were to be sustained, worship was to be celebrated, the vulnerable were to be cared for. The covenant community was to remember that all provision ultimately came from God. In that sense, the percentage served the purpose rather than becoming the purpose. When modern discussions focus exclusively on percentages, there is a risk that these larger covenant purposes may be overlooked. The biblical texts repeatedly direct attention not only to what was given, but also to the reasons for which it was given. Understanding those purposes is essential to understanding the tithing system itself. Modern reflection. As modern believers examine Israel's tithing system, the goal is not merely historical understanding, but a clearer view of God's heart. One of the striking features of the Old Testament system is its breadth. The tithe was never solely about funding religious activity. It touched worship, ministry, community life, celebration, hospitality, and care for the vulnerable. Through it, God provided for those who served in ministry, encouraged his people to rejoice before him, and ensured that the needs of the stranger, widow, and fatherless were not neglected. This challenges modern readers to think beyond percentages. Whether one concludes that the Old Testament tithe applies directly to Christians or not, the values embedded within the system remains instructive. God cares about the support of ministry, the worship of his people, and the care of those in need. These concerns are not merely features of an ancient covenant. They reflect enduring aspects of God's character. The New Testament will later direct our attention towards grace-filled and spirit-led generosity. Yet, even here, we see that God's concern extends beyond the transfer of resources to the formation of grateful, compassionate, and faithful hearts. Covenant-shaped generosity does not begin with a calculator, but with an understanding of God's goodness. When believers recognize that all they possess comes from Him, giving becomes an expression of worship, stewardship, and participation in His purposes. Think about this. 1. Why do you think God connected the tithe to so many aspects of Israel's covenant life? 2. What surprised you most about the different purposes served by the tithing system? 3. How does understanding the Levitical, festival, and third-year tithes affect your view of biblical tithing? 4. Why is it important to examine the purpose of a biblical practice and not merely its percentage? 5. What do the tithing laws reveal about God's concern for ministry, worship, and the vulnerable?